Right, anyway, I'm talking about this, and the tricky bit is impact. So we'll see if in the next 20 minutes, just 20 minutes, isn't it? And there is no clock, so hang on, I'll take this off. Whether we can conclude anything about the impact of open access to research. Anyway, so I'm talking about those things. What is open access, pros and cons, and trying to focus on this issue of quality versus quantity, because there is certainly no shortage of quantity when we're talking about open access research articles in medicine. And I'm also going to talk about the sharing of raw data, not just articles. Don't worry, you're certainly not expected to read all the text on those. It's just to point out there's already quite a lot of free access, and it's not the same as open access. Free access is where journals, repositories and so on decide to make stuff freely available to everybody, often after it's been not freely available for a while. So for instance, PubMed Central over there on the right is provided by the American government, and as of a couple of weeks ago there were 2.2 million medical articles there freely available to anybody, and a lot of those have been published in journals where there's a paywall, but after 6 months or a year or whatever, the articles are moved into this repository and anybody can access them. And there are various other things, not least the Hinari scheme, which is a way of making the contents of scholarly journals completely freely available in countries with a low GDP. But for instance, countries like India, where there are very many poor people and very many poor and poorly resourced medical professionals, doesn't come under that because India actually has a rather large GDP. The problem there is the huge disparity between rich and poor. So I'm afraid there isn't enough free access in countries like India. So here I am, I'm from a journal, and I'm from mainly the BMJ, although we've also got a new journal, BMJ Open, which I'm involved with. But journals cost money to produce and someone has to pay for it. And I know probably many of you here get really cross when you see something that you want to access and there's a paywall and you think, damn it, why isn't it all free? Well, because somebody's got to pay for it to be produced, and it's a question of how you do that and what the best way is. And what you're mainly paying for is a peer review process that is well managed and appropriate, some decision making, and then some editing, hosting on the web, indexing, all those sorts of things. And at the moment, nobody has come up with a different model that seems very sustainable for providing peer review and all of that, and sort of online hosting and all of that, without using something like a journal or some other fairly well-resourced website. But anyway, how do you pay for journals? Well, you have subscriptions, or you have some advertising and sponsorship, or you have what you call source pays, and that's where we're moving into now, big time. And that means that either the people who did the research or the people who funded the research, ideally, pay for its publication if the research is accepted after peer review. Now you may wonder about the BMJ. There are two models, main models of open access. One is where the publisher actually makes articles openly accessible, deliberately so. So either the whole journal is an open access journal, and that is funded by people paying when their articles are published, or stuff that's been behind the paywall gets moved over to one of those free resources I mentioned earlier, or there's a sort of hybrid model. At the BMJ, British Medical Journal, we've been doing a weird hybrid thing for quite a while. Initially, back in the 90s, 1994, the whole of the BMJ online was free to everybody. And then gradually our commercial people said, do you have to give it all away all the time? And they got us to introduce a paywall, apart from for the research articles, which have remained free. Meanwhile, our sister journals, the BMJ journals, of which there are now more than 40, all have an option of paying to unlock articles if you or your funder would like them to be openly accessible. So there's lots of different models, but all of those come under what's called gold, where the publisher does something to make stuff available. And then there's what they call green, where the authors say, well, okay, it's been published in this journal, nobody can read it, but I'm going to put it on my institutional website or somewhere else on the web. And publishers let you do that within the terms of their copyright, but it's usually, can't be their PDF, it's got to be some sort of preprint version. Anyway, so that's all that, a bit technical, but in the end it means you can read the article, that's good. So open access is something which journals have been fiddling around with for a while. and waiting to see what, if you like, the sort of market would do. And it now seems that the market has decided that the way forward is open access to research. So even, for instance, Nature has opened an open access journal, in fact more than one. And this pressure is coming from all over the place, not least from government bodies. So on the right-hand side, you have there the European Commission, who have come out big time and said that they expect research that they have funded to be made available. And here in the UK, there's JISC, which used to stand for the Joint Information Something Committee, but it's now not called that anymore. But it's basically something to do with higher education and access to academic resources. Even our MPs, certainly here in the UK, have come out recently supporting the idea of open access to research. They did this really rather interesting and quite thorough review of peer review and reported on it actually just last week, or rather the committee made its report and then Parliament responded last week. And they gave the thumbs up to open access too and said it's going to be important and interesting to watch how this pans out. There are loads of funders and institutions who now also say, if we're going to support your research, you've got to make it openly available when it's published. And there are these resources which link to all the institutions and funders that have these policies. So does this mean that the days of the traditional journals are numbered, where you've got a print thing and you've got a subscription and nobody can read it unless they are a member or a subscriber? Well, maybe, because researchers too are saying that actually they quite like open access. This was a survey of more than 16,000 researchers, nearly 17,000, in 162 countries, with typically a very low response rate, I have to say, as there always is in these sort of emailed surveys. It was, I don't know, 30% or something. But that top thing, for those of you at the back, says scientific community benefit, and more than a third said that certainly their field would be advanced and would benefit from publication in open access journals. And just this week, a bunch of computer scientists have got together and have said that they're going to boycott all journals that do not provide open access, and they're only going to submit their work to open access journals. So, I guess the advantages are pretty obvious. There's the argument that public money is being spent twice. It's being spent to generate research by training up and providing resources for researchers, and then paying again through library subscriptions to access that work that's been paid for with public money, and that's immoral and a waste of money. So that's a very strong sort of public good argument for open access. Of course, you've got a very wide audience, and those people in countries which are not able to use the completely free Hinari scheme can access the research, and so on. There's the argument that it's better for evidence-based medicine and evidence-based policy and practice if you can get hold of evidence more easily. Certainly, open access is much more author-centric. So it's saying journals are here for authors. We're here to make life easier for you and get your research published quickly and disseminated very widely. And to a large extent, certainly the newer models of open access are cutting out the middleman, people like me, or to some extent. And I'll talk a bit more about this idea of whether you judge journals by their impact factor and the number of citations to their articles, or whether you look at things like downloads. Okay, so a lot of people say, well, hang on a minute, if you're saying, here's some money, you're going to publish my article, that's dodgy and it's vanity publishing. But as I explained, most of these open access journals don't work that way. They say, submit your article, you know, it might get rejected, it's going to be peer reviewed if it's good enough, and if it gets accepted after peer review, then you need to pay actually to cover our costs of all the stuff we've done to get it this far and to look after your article once it's accepted. So is it vanity publishing? Well, there are examples of some dodgy open access journals that do seem to do this, but certainly I will defend the journals I know from this accusation. Equally, there's the argument that the process I just described would open the door to quite a lot of bias and conflict of interest when you've got money changing hands in that way. One big criticism is that open access journals have a low rejection rate, and therefore you just get completely overwhelmed with stuff, and you encourage people who shouldn't be doing research and certainly shouldn't be getting it published to submit it and get it published, and that's a bad thing, and the problems with quality. Other people are saying, well, it's the end of the reader, because these journals don't think about readers. They are online repositories of peer-reviewed research. They don't have the reader in mind, and I'll explain this more as we go along. To a large extent, they're cutting out the editor. I'll explain that too. Traditional journals certainly do see this as a threat, and some publishers are very anti-open access for this reason. And there are professional societies that make a lot of money out of publishing journals. They make a lot of money because people join the society in order to get the journal, and they make money by getting libraries to subscribe to the journal and by selling reprints to articles that are published in the journal. So there might be quite a few medical societies that are looking a bit worried by the growth of open access publishing. And maybe that's not a good thing overall if those societies don't find another way of making money and surviving. So the too much information argument does certainly have some traction. This was a paper in PLOS ONE, which is the biggest open access journal there is, and it's growing by the second, publishing thousands and thousands and thousands of articles across medicine and science. Since 2000, so over the last decade, journals overall have grown annually by, on average, 3.5%. Not sure where they got that from. I'll have to read the paper again to find exactly where they got that from. It must be a guess to some extent. But for the so-called gold open access journals, the journals which are through and through open access journals, and that's how they're set up, the annual growth is 18%. So they're new journals opening all the time. And the articles in them, the number of articles overall, is growing by 30% a year. And that's exponential, undoubtedly. Oh, look, there we are. So the red line is the number of open access journals. The axis down the bottom goes from 1993 to 2009. And the blue line is the number of articles in those open access journals. And yes, it's growing fast. So what's happening in terms of the quality? This is an evidence-based conference that we're all at today, and the 5 steps that have been kicking around for quite a while now, the 5 steps to evidence-based practice, are as follows. And again, perhaps you can't see at the back because it's a titchy screen, but the first says translation of uncertainty to an answerable question, then systematic retrieval of the best evidence available. And I've put available in red because available means that you can get hold of it. And if getting hold of it means that you've got to get out your credit card and pay to view the article, often you won't, because often you don't really want to. In the old days, it used to mean asking a librarian, and they'd take 3 weeks to get it from some other library, or the British Library or somewhere, some print thing. But now it usually means you having to pay something. So inevitably, open access articles are likely to be being fed into the evidence-based loop more frequently than other kinds of article. One example is Twitter Journal Club. For those of you who don't know anything about Twitter, you just shut your eyes and ears for a minute. But Twitter Journal Club is pretty amazing. It started really only a few months ago, and the people who run it select an article, a journal article each week, and they encourage people who follow them on Twitter to join them in a virtual discussion, all in tweets of 140 characters, about that paper each week on a Sunday night. And within weeks, there were thousands of people taking part, or certainly thousands of people watching, and quite a lot of people actively taking part. And certainly at first, Twitter Journal Club was only using openly accessible articles because it doesn't really work if everyone's got no access, particularly as it's on a Sunday night and you're not probably logging on from your university or your hospital, but you're logging on from home or through your mobile. There was, back in 2005, there was something rather grandiosely called the Sicily Statement. I guess it's because they were all in Sicily when they came up with it, but it was a bunch of eminent evidence-based practice people who got together and decided what the prerequisites were for evidence-based practice. And again, they talked about the best available current, valid and relevant evidence, which to my mind mostly means that you can get hold of it. However, This movement is worrying people, this push towards open access. On the one hand here, there's 2 articles from Comment is Free in The Guardian. On the left-hand side, you have a piece by David Cahoon, who doesn't like a lot of things. He doesn't like complementary medicine. He's not awfully keen on open access because he says you just fill up the world with a load of old rubbish, and that you seriously lower the threshold for publication, and that's just really bad news for everyone. On the other hand, you have George Monbiot, who says these journals that don't provide open access are absolutely ghastly, they're all dreadful and they should all be shot. So somewhere in the middle, you've got to come up with the perfect journal, and neither of them, I think, have found it. So what about the impact of open access publishing? When people talk about impact in the journal world, they talk about impact factor, which, as some of you will know, is a ratio that's worked out and based on the number of citations to articles in the whole journal. And it's a ratio over the number of articles in the journal. I won't bore you with the details. But what it counts, what it measures, is how useful some of the articles in a journal are to academics. It tells you nothing about ordinary readers, about clinicians, policymakers. It just says somebody thought this was interesting enough to add it to the reference list when they wrote a paper. That's all that this measures. But it's all we've got at the moment. We haven't got much else. And here are some open access journals with reasonable impact factors. PLOS One is the one over here, which out there in the blogosphere is being called the blob because it's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's going to take over the world. And it came in with an impact factor of 4.41, which, if you know anything about impact factor, is pretty damn good. The BMJs went down this year, but being the BMJ, we don't mind too much. It's because we published loads more articles on practical educational stuff, and that messed up the ratio, and we thought, oh, well, hey-ho. So ours is there at 13 something, and there's BMC Medicine 5.75. So these are perfectly respectable impact factors. And so at least in terms of academic credentials and that measure of impact, these journals are doing fine. There's this great debate, again, which may bore you witless, but it's about whether open access articles are likely to get cited more. Well, given what I've said so far, you would think so, but actually it's proving hard to find evidence for that. There have been a couple of randomized controlled trials, but they're terribly artificial and artifactual, as most trials are, but even more so when it comes to things like articles rather than patients. Open access articles are absolutely downloaded more, but that's not at all surprising. Are they cited more? Actually, the jury is still out. So given that this is all a bit of a mess and it's very hard to measure the impact of what you do when you're publishing research, the BMJ for many years now has looked at what we consider to be things that really matter when you're deciding whether or not research articles have got some traction and some usefulness. We have a fantastic full-time researcher who does lots of really decent academic research, but also does some in-house stuff for us. And every year she looks at all the research papers we've published in the BMJ, and it's between 250 and 300 research articles each year, and she looks at all of these things. So it isn't just citations and downloads, it's also the post-publication peer review that carries on, because we have these e-letters called referred responses to most of our articles. And it's very useful to see how the debate carries on after publication, with other authors saying, well, hang on a minute, did you look at this? And by the way, we don't agree with that bit, and we've done our own analysis, and and we've done our own study. So the debate carries on. But we've also looked at whether the research papers get picked up in the sort of EBM alerting services such as Journal Watch and Evidence Updates and Faculty of 1000. Increasingly, you see this sort of thing on journal websites as well, which shows you how many times articles have been downloaded. Authors like these. I'm not sure anybody else really cares. But this is to tell you a quick plug for BMJ Open, which is our new journal, which is online only. It's general medicine, and it is one of those journals where if it's accepted, you pay. But you pay not terribly much, and we're always open to people saying, I've got no money, can you waive the fee? And we go, oh, all right then. As a lot of journals do, the Public Library of Science PLOS journals do that too. Anyway, so that's what it's about. But one of the things we are doing, which is really different, is that we're encouraging authors to not just submit their articles, but if their articles are accepted, we're encouraging them to go and put their data set, the raw data that is behind their study, in a repository which we're linked to called Dryad, which is down there. I'll show you another slide in a minute, but those are some papers in BMJ Open. Dryad basically is a repository for data, but it's only for data linked to published articles. So if you were dead keen to find out and perhaps have a go at replicating a study that had been published in BMJ Open, you could go to Dryad, you could find the data set. It's linked to the article with electronic links called DOIs. We hope that over time this will encourage much more transparency and also much more sharing of data that have been generated by research, which hopefully will reduce the amount of waste that goes on when research gets published and then forgotten about and never used again. Data sharing is also hot stuff, and lots of funders are saying that they really quite like authors to share the raw data from their studies. And a whole bunch of them, including the Wellcome Trust and INSERM and the Gates Foundation, came out with a big shared statement which was published in The Lancet earlier this year. However, it doesn't have any teeth. It's not saying that if you don't do this, we'll take your grant away. It just says, oh, go on, why don't you have a go? But researchers are beginning to get the hang of this as well. The Royal Society at the moment has an inquiry which is ongoing. They've just accepted all their evidence and they're having a think about it. But they're having an inquiry at the moment about science as a public enterprise, and the gist of that is that they're looking at the scope for sharing raw data, not just articles. Just this month, the Cochrane Library has an editorial by Peter Gutcher saying that authors of Cochrane reviews jolly well ought to share the raw data, not just their published systematic reviews. And in December, on December the 17th, the BMJ is going to have a theme issue. This is slightly different. This isn't saying that if you're publishing your research now, please share your data. It's saying, bring out your dead. It's saying, if you did studies years and years and years ago and you never got them published and you've got data lurking in dustbins and drawers, bring them out now, for God's sake, because the evidence base is horribly skewed. And that's what this theme issue is about in December. Last slide, running out of time, probably overrun. Data sharing is all very well, but it really is a darn sight more open than just publishing articles in journals where people can access them. Sure, we have got the message by now that if you publish a case report about a patient, that you ought to have their consent to publish that, because the days of that case report sitting in a dogged journal in the corner of a library gathering dust are long gone. It's very possible now that if something about a patient is published in a journal, it will be findable by Google, and patients looking for information about their condition may come across them and go, hang on, I think that's me. Indeed it is, because there's a photo of me with a black thing on my eyes. And we know that about case reports, but increasingly it's becoming obvious that even in a very large study, you might have table 10 with enough clinical information about 20 patients that they could identify themselves. And the data protection people here in England say that what you're looking for is a level of evidence that a good investigative journalist could use to identify someone. And so there are big problems with the idea of data sharing if you're doing studies and you're not saying to participants, please may I have consent for you to be in the study? Please may I have consent for me to do this stuff to you in the study? Please may I have consent to publish whatever we find in journal articles? Oh, and by the way, can we put all the raw data about you somewhere on the internet? And researchers at the moment are not asking all those questions. People get freaked out too at the idea that somebody else will come in with some sort of agenda and try and manipulate their research results by looking at the raw data again. And there are all sorts of technical and practical problems with sharing data in sort of sustainable ways. So lots of questions there, but that's the end. Sorry, a quick romp through it, and I don't know if you're any the wiser about the impact of open access publishing, but I'm very happy to answer some questions over tea or whenever it is that we get to talk. Thank you.
Just a quick question, I guess, on the idea of sharing data. And I noticed one of the challenges that you had up there was one of who owns the data. And I always kind of think that's a bit of a funny idea, often given that as researchers are often publicly funded and the research itself is publicly funded. And I wondered to what extent researchers feel that they own that data. And also, taking a step further, wonder to what extent that's the real reason why more data isn't shared.
Yeah, no, it's a very very good question. I mean, people have talked about a period of fair use, because if you've put, months or years of your life into a study, and that's an important career move for you, which it usually is, you don't want to go and give everything away at once and then you're not going to publish any more papers. So there are lots of options when it comes to data sharing. You can either put the whole thing up on the web immediately and people can help themselves, or you can say, I'm going to sit on the data for 3 years and publish loads of papers, and then you can have them. Or you don't say, I'm putting it all on the web, because actually that opens up a whole can of worms, but I'm going to set up a panel and you can come to me with a decent hypothesis, and if I like your research question and you've got a good method and our peer reviewers say it's okay, we'll give you permission and we'll give you personal access to the data, but they won't be freely available on the web. So there are all sorts of things, but you're quite right. I've had conversations with people who are going, we must have data sharing. You say, well, have you done it? And they go, no. Not yet, no, because when it comes to it, people don't want to do it for all sorts of reasons. And the pharmaceutical industry is very worried about it, because understandably they're worried about commercial problems, but they're also worried that people will come in and say, your drug was rubbish actually, and you've manipulated the data. And of course there are people on the other side of that argument saying, well, that would be great.
How do you see the interface between the mainstream media and open access, and the risk to spreading fear and misinterpretation of research data?
Well, okay, but
take the other two.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Well, I won't remember them because my brain's not big enough. But I'll be very quick. So you're saying that if you got an open access paper or a data set, then the public will get more scared. Well, evidence so far tends to show that the public get scared because they don't have that access. And what they get is a poorly written press release and a lot of hype, very often from the authors, I'm afraid to say, and then some degree of misreporting by the media, not always willfully, but sometimes so. And so people only get a tiny snapshot of the research, and if they had the whole thing, then they would actually have more chance of getting the appropriate message.
We're talking about open access. Do you think there's scope for openness to go further upstream? So one of the most obvious ideas is maybe open peer review. Mm-hmm. And you could ask a very broad question about does that have implications for more collaborative science? But I'll restrict myself to asking what implications do you think that has for journals?
Okay, you're obviously a mole coming from the BMJ, because now I can say, yes, the BMJ uses open peer review. BMJ for ages has used open peer review where reviews are signed, and so the authors know who has reviewed their work. And so everybody knows who everybody is, and they can't be rude about each other anymore, which, let me tell you, used to happen when I went to the BMJ. It had to literally physically cut and paste the reviews that came in, stick them back together with glue and photocopy them to take out all the insulting, horrible stuff that reviewers said very frequently. But that's not open to readers, but BMJ Open does the whole full-on open thing. So if you send your paper to BMJ Open and it is published, it'll be published with the reviews next to it, which you can click on. You can see the submitted paper, you can see the reviews, the revised paper, the reviewers' further comments. And again, you might think, blimey, why would anybody want to look at all that? But actually, it gives reviewers credit for their work. And for some papers, it's really fascinating to see how it got to publication. And also, it means that if we've all made a terrible hash of it and the thing shouldn't have been published and the peer review was appalling, then you can have a look, you can come and make comments, and we can learn and do it better.
I just wondered about BMJ Open and OUP clinical journals, like many publishers, give authors the option to choose to publish their paper open access, but not many choose to spend their own money on it. They do have funding, and we see that in our experience the take-up is reasonably low. I just wondered what your experience is of whether authors that don't have funding are paying for themselves for open access, and when they are, why? What they see as their incentive? The
first thing to say in these journals is that the decision, whether or not people can pay, the people making the decision about the paper are oblivious to that. So even if you see that a paper is funded by the Wellcome or whatever, it may well be that they had a grant and it's all run out and they've got no money left to pay a fee. So if the authors say, look, I can't pay, and it's been accepted, you say, okay, sod it, we'll publish it anyway. So that's how that works. The decision makers have no idea it's dealt with by an admin person. And that is what's happening. We've published our 100th paper, actually, in BMJ Open. We opened in February, so we've published 100 papers as of this week. And again, I don't know, because I'm the editor-in-chief, and I'm not at all involved in those decisions, but I understand that I think it's about 55% or something, 60% have paid, and the rest haven't. And that's fine. We don't ask any questions if people say they can't pay.